It was the end of the Sunday service, and the minister processed down the main aisle, out through the vestibule, and ensconced himself on the top step to his church, waiting for the people to leave, so he could wish them a good week. Now, in the congregation that day was a young couple with a little boy, a 5-year-old. And they came in, and the pastor shook their hands and wished them a good week. And the little boy looked up at the pastor and said, you know, when I grow up, I'm going to give you a whole lot of money. And the pastor kind of chuckled and threw his head back and said, well, Tommy, why do you say that? And he says, well, my dad says you're the poorest preacher he ever heard. Poor. We hear about a poor woman in today's gospel, don't we? The woman with the hemorrhages. She had been suffering for 12 years, had used up all her money to buy the services of professional doctors, and all that had happened was that she had gotten worse. I hope Dr. Krause isn't here today to hear that. But anyway, the professional doctors did nothing for her. But she heard of a faith healer, a folk healer, who had done marvelous wonders, mighty deeds, and cures. So she thought, if I just touch his hem, the hem of his garment, this Jesus from Nazareth, maybe I'll be healed. And she did, and she was healed. I've been on vacation for a while, and as you know, and so when I looked at the readings for today, I kind of got excited because today's reading from Mark particularly is a very famous section of Mark's gospel for a particular reason. And we've been in Mark for a while. It's this gospel we'll hear for the rest of this liturgical year, except that in a couple of weeks, when we get to chapter 6 of Mark, we're going to switch to chapter 6 of John. And that's the section for the multiplication of loaves and fishes. And John has that wonderful bread of life discourse. And so we're going to go from Mark to John for a few weeks and then come back to Mark again. But we're in chapter 5 of Mark right now. So let me give you a little bit of background on Mark. For the longest time in the church, Mark was kind of the forgotten gospel. It's kind of pushed to the side for various reasons. One of the reasons was it was so short. And in fact, people thought it was an abridged version of Matthew or Luke, mainly Matthew. And it was so dark and bleak. It had a great emphasis on Jesus' humanity. You know, Mark seems to be telling us that the only way we can know the true identity of Jesus is not through his mighty deeds, through miracles like we hear today, but through his suffering and death on the cross and the empty tomb, and that kind of a thing. And in fact, if I did an informal poll this morning and said, what's your favorite gospel? I'd probably the only one who would raise his hand for Mark. And there's a sentimental reason for that, and I don't have time to tell you that today. Ask me some other time why I like Mark rather than Matthew and Luke or John. But you would probably tell me John or Luke was your favorite. John because of all those wonderful dialogues between Jesus and Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman at the well and raising of Lazarus and all those kinds of things. And Luke because of the infancy narratives and because of his wonderful parables he tells us about in the prodigal son and those kinds of things, the Good Samaritan. Matthew was favored for the longest time because it was the only gospel in which the word ecclesia appeared. The word for church, it appeared twice. Church doesn't appear in the other three gospels, as a matter of fact. And so Matthew was favored, but Mark was this thing, you know, it's just kind of pushed off to the side. We know that the grammar is very bad and all those kinds of things. And it wasn't until the 19th century when some German Lutheran scripture scholars started using some scientific tools and came to realize that Mark was terribly important. And the reason was, we believe, our hypothesis is that Mark was written first. It's not an abridgment of Matthew or Luke. It was written first. And it's the only gospel to say that it is a gospel. Remember, Mark begins with, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the words of the prophet. The other ones don't begin that way. although we call them Gospels too. Gospel was, in the ancient world, an oral proclamation. Some good news that was going to happen. The emperor's wife had a child. The emperor was coming to visit. There was going to be free bread and circuses next week. That kind of a thing. And Mark's the first one that actually turns Evangelion in Greek, gospel, into a written form. But his writing is very, very terrible. Now, when they did this, they found out that all of Mark is contained in Matthew and Luke, but 8 verses. And what's part of Mark that's not in Matthew is in Luke, and the part of Mark that's not in Luke is in Matthew. So it's all there between the other 2 Gospels that they took it. But they cleaned up his language. His Greek is terrible. He'd have gotten an F in composition class by the instructors because he doesn't use good Greek. Luke does. There's people that say that people would have read the Gospel of Luke and Acts, the 2nd volume, as just as literature. They may not have been interested in who Jesus was, but his Greek was so good and the story was so good, they would read it like a romance novel, that kind of a thing. Well, you can't say that with Mark. In fact, what Mark does is he tells Jesus' story very much like that 5-year-old Tommy would have told his day with his dad at the Memphis Zoo. Picture this. Tommy comes home. Mom says, "How did you do today at the zoo, Tommy?" "Well, Dad and I go to the cage with the monkeys, and we see the monkeys being fed. Then we go to the lions thing. Then we go to see a camel." So he tells everything in the present tense. And that's what Mark does. It's called the historical present. But when it's translated, we put it back into the past tense. So we don't hear how Jesus goes to Capernaum. We hear how Jesus went to Capernaum when the English is translated. So for all these reasons, Mark was really just put down. But those German Lutheran scholars and our own Catholic scholars in the 20th century, because the Pontifical Biblical Commission says the same thing. If you go back and read their writings, that Mark was probably the first one written, and that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark when they were writing. That makes Mark very significant, doesn't it? It's the first one. Now, Mark does have a literary style, and that's why I was so excited when I saw what the reading was today. Mark likes to start something that's called story A and stop it. And then he tells us story B to completion. Then he picks up story A again to completion. And scholars call this an intercalation. Affectionately, it's referred to as a Markan sandwich. Because story A is like the bread, and story B is like the bologna or the peanut butter and jelly in the center of the thing. And it's put together. So what is Mark saying? Mark is saying these are not 2 separate stories. These are all the same story. The woman with the hemorrhages and the little girl. What happens with the woman with the hemorrhages? She's been suffering for 12 years. How old is the little girl? She's 12 years old. Now, because the woman had the hemorrhages, not only did she use up all her money, she was like a dead woman walking. She was always ritually impure because she was in the presence of blood. So she couldn't go into the temple area at all. She couldn't go into the holy. She was ostracized from her community. She was like a dead woman walking. So this is a death story, if you will. But she says, I have the faith, I have the allegiance to this Jesus, and I have the hope and the trust that if I just touch him, that I can be cured. And it happens. Jairus has faith and hope too, doesn't he? He comes to Jesus and says, please come and cure my little girl. She's about to die. And she is 12 years old. Now at 12, people were brought into a marriage contract, weren't they? They were betrothed with the idea that in a couple of years they would be married and they would have children. The woman with the hemorrhages, because of her condition, probably never had children either. And this little girl, by dying at 12, she's never going to have children either. And that's so important in the ancient world to have a child and to carry on the family name. Now, just so you don't think this is an unusual occurrence, we know from sociology that if a child survives infancy, by the time they were 6 years old, a third of them would have died. By the time they were in their mid-teens, 60% would have died. By the time they were in their 20s, mid-20s, 75% of people died. And by the time they were in their mid-40s, 90%. Life expectancy was not much at all. So what does that mean? When Jesus preached to the crowd, most of them were younger than him, if he was 30 or 33, and they had less than 10 years, a decade to live. So when Jesus says, just worry about today, don't worry about tomorrow, there was no tomorrow for these people. Their lives were terribly short. And so it was the now that they were interested in. So Jesus comes, he touches the girl, again, touch. His power goes out just like the one with the hemorrhages, and he raises her up back to life. Just like he brought, from a psychological and emotional point of view, that woman with the hemorrhages from death to life. And he's done it with the little girl. What about that wonderful touch at the end? Hey, give her something to eat. She's probably hungry. Dying must be difficult. Now, I just had a nerve block the other day, and they tell you to fast from noon, and it didn't happen until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so I got out about 4, so it was like 16 hours where I hadn't eaten, and I went to Perkins, and they had the Magnificent Seven plus the side order of corned beef hash and about a jug of coffee. So this little girl probably was hungry when she was raised up. Now that's all the biblical exegesis. That's nice to know. But what about us? See, Jesus is the one who makes whole. Jesus is the one who restores people back to their normal way of life, back to society in terms of the woman, back to life itself in terms of the little girl. And sometimes we pray to Jesus for miracles. We have St. Jude's Hospital here that does miracles every day through medicine. And Jesus is there with them. Okay? It's St. Jude after all. And the main way that Jesus restores is spiritually, isn't it? And that's what's important for you and me. He makes us whole. He restores us. He brings us back to spiritual life. I spent one part of my vacation doing a retreat at St. Meinrad, and I could feel that week that I was at St. Meinrad, that I had been restored back to life through my retreat. And he can do that for us. How does he do that? He's not physically here. He does it through the sacraments, doesn't he? Particularly the sacrament of penance. Particularly the sacrament of Eucharist that we're celebrating right now. He can restore us, bring us back to spiritual health. But the trick is, we have to be like the woman with the hemorrhages. And we have to be like Jairus. We have to have the faith, allegiance to him. We have to have the hope to trust that he can do it. In other words, we only be restored by Jesus if we let him.